Most people talk about dividends as if they are arguing about religion. One group says, I would never sell my shares in retirement. I will just live off the dividends and keep my principal forever. Another group says dividends do not matter at all. Only total return matters, and anyone focusing on dividends is fooling himself. I have never liked that kind of debate, not because the topic is unimportant, because both sides usually begin with something true and then stretch it until it becomes less true. Dividends are not magic, but they are not meaningless either. The trouble begins when investors stop asking what a dividend really is and start asking only how a dividend feels. And I understand why it feels different when cash lands in your account. It feels like income. It feels as though the portfolio paid you without requiring any decision from you. It feels gentler than selling shares. It feels cleaner. It feels less threatening. For many people, it feels like living off the fruit without cutting down the tree. That image is powerful. It is also incomplete because in markets, feelings and mechanics are not always the same thing. The source text you gave me begins exactly where the confusion begins. It explains that a dividend is not free money, that the share price adjusts downward by roughly the dividend amount on the ex-dividend date, and that from a mathematical standpoint, dividends and share sales are both ways money leaves a portfolio. It then makes the more important move by refusing to stop there. It admits that dividends may not be magical, but they can still matter for investor behavior, discipline, and retirement psychology. That is the right place to begin. Feifelicite Feiturn 24 File 0 Fe, if I were explaining this as honestly as I could. I would say it this way. A dividend is a transfer. Money leaves the company and arrives in your hands. At the same time, the company has a little less cash than it had before. That is why the share price adjusts. That is why the investor is not richer, simply because a dividend was paid. He had $100 in stock. Now he may have $98 in stock and $2 in cash. That feels different. Economically, it is not a miracle. That is the part many people do not want to hear. They want dividends to be superior to selling because selling feels like loss. But if money is leaving the portfolio, money is leaving the portfolio one way or another. That is the first truth. And yet there is another truth sitting right beside it. People are not spreadsheets. Behavior matters, emotion matters, the ability to stay the course matters. The source material says this directly too. It points out that even though dividends and selling shares are mathematically similar, many retirees still experience them very differently. For some, seeing natural income arrive helps them stay invested and feel less anxious during volatile periods. That behavioral resilience has real value. The mistake is not in preferring dividends. The mistake is in assuming the emotional preference automatically creates a superior financial plan. Feifelicite Feiturn 24 File 0 Fe. I think that distinction is everything. A strategy can feel better without being mathematically better. A strategy can be mathematically stronger while still being behaviorally too difficult for the person living inside it. That is why serious investing has to speak two languages at once, the language of arithmetic and the language of human behavior. If you ignore arithmetic, you become sentimental. If you ignore behavior, you become theoretical. Good investing requires both. Now let us widen the lens. One reason dividend arguments become so confused is that people quote history without understanding what history was actually measuring. The source text does something very useful here. It points out that from around 1940 through 2024, dividends contributed roughly 1/3 of the S&P 500's total return on average. That sounds like an overwhelming victory for dividends until you read the next sentence and understand the assumption underneath it. Those historical figures assume dividends were reinvested, not spent. In other words, the power came from dividends buying more shares, which then paid more dividends, which bought more shares. Again, the compounding engine, not the cash withdrawal itself, created the huge long-term result. Feifelicite Feiturn 24 File 0 Fe. That is one of the most important things an investor can understand. Dividends are incredibly powerful when they are reinvested. They are much less powerful when they are consumed. That is not because spending them is wrong. It is because spending interrupts the compounding loop that made those historical charts so beautiful in the first place. The source file uses a long-run estimate showing that $100 invested in the SP in 1926 with dividends reinvested grows to an enormous sum by the end of 2025, while the outcome without reinvestment is only a tiny fraction of that. I think that illustration is valuable because it teaches the right lesson. The magic was not the dividend by itself. The magic was the dividend being turned back into ownership again and again for decades. Faithfully cite Turn 24 File 0 Fay. So when a young investor says dividends made up a large share of long-term stock market returns, he is saying something true. But if he then uses that fact to justify a dividend-only spending plan decades later, he may be quietly changing the premise. History was talking about reinvestment. Retirement is often about distribution. Those are not the same thing. That brings us to the present day. The source text makes another important observation that many people still have not fully absorbed. The market our grandparents grew up with was not the same market we have. Now, dividend yields used to be much higher. Broad U.S. stock yields often sat in the 3 to 5% range. In the modern era, especially since the early 1900s, broad market yields have been much lower, often around 1 to 2%. The reasons include the rise of growth and technology companies that reinvest rather than pay large dividends, the use of share buybacks, and stock prices rising faster than dividends. Cite Turn 24 File 0 Fay that changes the conversation dramatically. A person could once imagine living mostly off dividends from a broad portfolio with much less strain. Today, a person trying to live off dividends alone from a broad-based U.S. stock portfolio usually faces a much harder arithmetic problem. He needs a much larger portfolio, or he must reach for higher yield sectors, specialized funds, REITs, utilities, energy, telecom, or various products built to deliver income first. And that introduces another kind of risk. That is why I do not like simple slogans here. If you want to live off dividends only in today's market, you are often trading one difficulty for another. You are trading the discomfort of selling shares for the difficulty of needing much more capital or much more concentration. That is not automatically a bad trade, but it is a trade. And adults should name their trades. Now let me turn to taxes, because this is another place where investors often repeat half-truths with too much confidence. The source text explains this very well. Qualified dividends and long-term capital gains often receive the same favorable tax rates, commonly 0%, 15%, or 20%, depending on the household's tax situation. On the surface, that makes dividends and long-term gains look equally attractive. But then the source makes the more important point. The tax rate may be similar, yet the flexibility is not. Dividends are forced realizations. They arrive when the company decides to pay them. Capital gains are elective realizations. You choose when to sell. That difference in timing control can be enormously valuable, especially in retirement, when tax brackets, Social Security taxation, and Medicare surcharges can all be affected by how much income shows up in a given year. Cite Turn 24 File 0 Fay. That is the sort of nuance serious investors should care about. Control is valuable. Optionality is valuable. A person who can decide when to realize gains has a planning tool. A person whose portfolio sends out taxable dividends on its own has less control, even if the tax rate on those dividends may look friendly. And then there is another layer. Not all dividends are qualified. The source text says this plainly too. REITs, bond funds, many international holdings, and some high-yield strategies can produce dividends taxed as ordinary income rather than at qualified dividend rates. That means the simple phrase dividends are tax efficient is only sometimes true. Again, context matters. Cite Turn 24 File 0 Fay. This is why I say dividends are a tool, not a religion, not a magic machine, a tool, and a tool must be judged by the job. That becomes especially obvious when age enters the conversation. One of the strongest parts of your source file is the age by age breakdown, because it stops pretending a 25-year-old and a 70-year-old should use income investing the same way. That is one of the biggest mistakes in public money advice. People hear a single idea and try to make it universal. But investing is not one conversation. It is a sequence of different conversations across a life. Cite Turn 24 File 0 Fay in your 20s. Growth is usually the best friend you have. Time is long. Compounding is hungry. Career income is likely still rising. At that stage, a person does not need his portfolio to act like a paycheck. He needs it to act like an engine. The source text says this very clearly. High-yield dividend strategies in your 20s often force a trade you do not need, exchanging long-term growth for current cash flow that you are not even spending. In most cases, the better move is to let any dividends be reinvested automatically and allow them to quietly add fuel to a growth-dominant portfolio. That is exactly right. Cite Turn 24 File 0 Fay in your 30s. The logic is similar, though life begins to add complexity. Income usually rises, family decisions may start showing up, responsibility deepens. Yet the horizon is still very long. The source material handles this stage well too. It says growth should still dominate, though some investors may choose to add a touch of dividend, growth exposure if it helps them stay engaged. The key phrase is a touch, not a full transition into yield chasing 30 years before the cash flow is needed. That is smart advice. File site turn 24 file 0 in your 40s. Something interesting happens. The portfolio may finally be large enough that volatility feels real in a new emotional way. Now the conversation changes a bit, not because dividends have become magical, because stability and diversification may begin to matter more to the investor's actual experience. The source file describes this stage as a time when a blend can work well, keeping a broad market core, while perhaps adding some dividend growth or quality exposure for smoother behavior, but still reinvesting the income. I think that is a mature way to frame it. Dividends at this stage are not the paycheck. They are still part of the compounding engine. Fay turn 24, file 0 Fay. Then we reach the 50s and 60s. This is where the emotional force of the dividend story becomes much stronger. And for good reason at this point, retirement no longer looks theoretical. The question is no longer only how fast can the portfolio grow. It becomes how will the portfolio pay me? That is a very different question. The source text is wise here because it neither worships dividends nor dismisses them. It says dividends can absolutely become a useful tool in this stage. They can provide natural cash flow, reduce the psychological burden of selling shares, and play a role inside a broader total return framework. But it also makes the limitation clear. Broad index yields are often only 1 to 2%, and reaching for high yield introduces concentration, slower growth, or risk of dividend cuts. File site turn 24, file 0 Fay. That is exactly right. Dividends can help. They can calm, they can simplify, they can reduce the number of shares you must sell in a bad market, but they are not by themselves a complete retirement architecture for most people. A complete plan must also think about withdrawal rate, taxes, inflation, asset allocation, and the fact that spending needs do not always line up neatly with a company's payout schedule. Now let us talk about retirement itself, because this is where people often say the sentence with the most emotional force. I will just live off the dividends and never sell shares. I understand why that sentence is attractive. It feels like permanence. It feels like safety. It feels like your capital remains untouched, but the source text is right to challenge the sentence without mocking it. It points out that broad market dividends alone rarely cover a standard retirement withdrawal target in today's world. If a retiree needs something like 3.5% to 4.5% of portfolio value to support life, and the portfolio yields only 1 to 2%, then a dividends-only plan demands either a much larger nest egg or a much lower spending level. File site turn 24 file 0 Fay. That is just arithmetic. It is not an opinion about your personality. It is not an insult to your preference. It is arithmetic. And arithmetic deserves respect. This is where the hybrid approach becomes so sensible. The source file says the most successful retirees often blend several sources of cash flow, dividends, bond interest, realized capital gains, rebalancing cash buffers, and tax-aware sales. That is exactly what a grown-up system should look like. Not loyalty to one corner of the market, but a flexible structure designed around sustainable spending and human behavior. File site turn 24 file 0 Fay. I am especially glad the source text brings in required minimum distributions, because this is an area full of misunderstanding. A lot of retirees think that because their IRA or 401k throws off dividends, those dividends must automatically satisfy the RMD. But that is not how it works. The source material explains this very clearly. Dividends interest, or any other income generated inside the IRA or 401k count toward the RMD only when the money actually leaves the account. If the dividends stay inside, whether they are reinvested or just sitting in cash, they do not count. If they are withdrawn, they count. That distinction matters, and many retirees overlook it. Fay turn 24 file 0 Fay. That is another reason why slogans fail. Someone says, I will satisfy my RMD with dividends maybe, but only if those dividends are actually distributed out of the account. And even then, they may exceed or fall short of what you really need. This is why retirement planning must be done with more care than emotional proverbs. There is a second good point in that section too. You do not have to sell shares into cash just because an RMD is required. The source text mentions in-kind transfers, where shares themselves can be moved from the retirement account into a taxable account, and the fair market value of those shares counts toward the RMD. That matters because many retirees want to remain invested rather than liquidating everything into cash. Again, once you understand the mechanics, more tools become available. Fay-Fellow-Site, Fay-Turn-24, File 0, Fay, I like tools, I distrust dogma. That is why I think the best retirement plan is usually neither dividend only nor growth only. It is behavior aware, tax aware, and total return aware. It allows the retiree to sleep at night. It respects arithmetic, and it leaves enough flexibility that one market environment, one tax year, or one spending shock does not break the whole structure. The source text also does a practical comparison using Vanguard S High Dividend ETF and a more traditional withdrawal framework. The conclusion is straightforward at a roughly 2.4% yield. A retiree needs nearly double the capital to generate a given spending amount from dividends alone, compared with using a withdrawal framework around 4.7% or so. That does not mean dividend-only investing is wrong. It means it asks for a different trade, more capital in exchange for more psychological comfort and less selling. That is a perfectly respectable preference if the person can actually afford it. Fay-Fellow-Site, Fay-Turn-24, File 0, Fay. This is why I keep returning to the same phrase, name the trade. Do not romanticize it, do not demonize it, name it. If you want to live mostly off dividends, wonderful. But understand you may need a larger portfolio or lower spending. If you want to maximize total return flexibility, wonderful. But understand you must become psychologically comfortable with selling shares when appropriate. If you want a hybrid, that may often be the most reasonable path of all, but then build it intentionally, not accidentally. Now let me say something important about human behavior. A mathematically elegant plan that makes you panic is not elegant for you. A plan that is slightly less efficient but allows you to remain disciplined through deep bear markets may produce a better real-life outcome than a theoretically perfect one you abandon in fear. The source text says this too. In plain language, behavior can beat optimization. I think that sentence deserves to be engraved over the doorway of every retirement planning office in the country. People do not run out of money only because they picked the wrong ETF. They also run out of money because they chose strategies they could not emotionally live with. Fay-Fellow-Site, Fay-Turn-24, File 0, Fay. That is why I do not laugh at dividend preferences. I laugh only at certainty. I laugh only when a person says dividends are always the answer or never the answer, or selling shares is always foolish, or yield is always superior, or total return means dividends should be ignored completely. Those statements are childish. Serious investors should be capable of more adult sentence. Something like this. Dividends are one way a portfolio pays me. They are not free money. They are not nothing. They are one source of cash flow inside a broader plan. Now, if I had to compress the whole subject into a single framework, it would sound like this. When you are young, let dividends quietly compound in the background while growth does the heavy lifting. When you are in your middle years, use dividends as a secondary stabilizer if they help you stay the course, but do not mistake current income for the main objective too early. When you are approaching retirement, treat dividends as one useful component of a total return plan, not as a substitute for thinking. And when you are retired, build the cash flow system that fits your life, your taxes, your spending, and your sleep, using whatever blend of dividends, interest, sales, rebalancing, and account mechanics actually works. That, to me, is the mature answer, not dividends worship, not dividends contempt, just reality. And reality is enough because the real goal was never to receive income from one corner of the market only. The real goal was always this: reliable cash flow that lasts as long as you do. That is the standard. Everything else is just a preference about how you reach it.